Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So, sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. In 2023, 2 banks failed, and those were the first 2 bank failures since October of 2020, so they were kind of big. There have been 4 more bank failures since then, with the latest one April 26, 2024. What should the vendor team do? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 287, Replay, Bank Failures, Mergers, and Acquisitions, What the Vendor Team Must Do. Now, if you guys aren't already aware, the Republic First Bank, DBA Republic Bank of Philadelphia, failed on April 26, 2024, when it was closed by the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities. And when that happens, really no advance notice is given to the public, and that financial institution is closed. And so what ends up happening is the vendors, or you guys as the vendor team or as the buyers, can wonder, if you even hear about it, whether or not the vendors will have a change of banking, whether or not your payments will be made, whether or not fraudsters will take advantage of the situation. And so when the Silicon Bank and Signature Bank failed last year, I put out a podcast about what needs to be done in those circumstances. And I also had a LinkedIn article too. And so I'm going to replay that podcast because that information is still relevant. And it includes the scenarios when banks merge or get acquired, because that happens often as well. And so you want to make sure that you have processes in place when you see those activities occurring, or when you see an uptick in vendor change requests or returned payments because of those events. So I'm going to go ahead and replay it. And also on my YouTube channel, where I post the Vendor Master File Tip of the Week, on Tuesday, May 7th, the Vendor Master File Tip of the Week video is going to be about Republic Bank and some additional information on where you can get links to the failed banks from the FDIC. And then I am also going to link in the show notes the failed bank information specifically for Republic First Bank. So make sure you check all of those out. All right, here is the replay. So if some of you don't already know, I have a vendor process training center, which is really a new site that I stood up, published, made active early in January, probably late last week in December of 2022. And so that's the platform that I use for all the vendor trainings. And I've got, I don't know, 107 different training sessions every year because I have like the Wednesday, Thursday live sessions. And then I also have Q&A sessions that I do every Friday. And every Friday I am on from 12 to 2 Eastern time. And really anyone that signs up to the platform can join because it's a free session, right? You just enroll in it. It's no cost. And you can come on, just ask your question. Now, I'm going to be there the whole 2 hours. But you don't need to be there the whole 2 hours. You can jump on, ask your question, and then go on about your day. Now, you may think that I do that just for, the benefit and value of the users or team members or training pass members that I have. And yes, I do it for that reason. But I also learn so much from you guys based on the questions that you ask. So I get to understand what you're going through in the vendor setup and maintenance process. And I learned a lot during the last 2 or 3 years, and I'm sure you can understand why. But today I learned something else new. I had a training pass member actually come on, and she didn't stay on long, but she had a question about the fact that there was a bank that failed, and the bank that failed was in her state of California, and wanted to know, is there anything special that they needed to do? Well, that was a great question, and it all also was an enlightenment for me because I didn't realize that a bank had failed. This was news that had come out, that had just come out. And so I thought it would be great to talk about it over a podcast because there is some things that you will want to take into consideration and some steps that you will want to take. And so let me go ahead and just kind of get started with that. I do want to say, though, that I typically have this saying when I talk to clients or anyone about banks or banks that are in your vendor master file. I say that banks are acquired or merged all the time. And then I go on to talk about, what steps they need to take when that happens. But now I will change what I say to banks fail, are acquired, or merged all the time after this recent story. And thank you, Lauren, for letting me know. In the New York Times and probably also on most major news outlets. But the title of this article for the New York Times is Silicon Valley Bank Fails After Run by Venture Capital Customers. And so that reminded me that in addition to banks being merged or acquired, banks also failed or also can fail. And so when that happens, there are some additional steps to take. And this is a great example because the FDIC closed this bank. And so they also, at the same time, created a new bank. And for the Silicon Valley Bank, the new bank that the FDIC has created is the National Bank of Santa Clara. And that bank was created to hold the deposits and assets of the failed one. And so that was per this article. And I am going to leave a link in the show notes for the article in case you want to read it. But what that really means for the vendor team is that the routing number has changed, right? At least the routing number has changed. It also could mean that the bank account number has changed as well. But I won't know that until I do some research, and this bank won't even be available until like 4 days from now. So while I can't give specific routing number information for this particular scenario, I can give you the steps that you need to take and also what you need to watch out for when banks fail, when they are acquired, and when they are merged. That will change the bank's routing number and may also change the vendor's bank account number that you have on file in the vendor master file. So I'm actually going to separate or categorize the those steps based on two different ways that is going to trigger a change. So the first way is non-vendor team related. So I guess that's a push. And then the second way is the vendor team initiated, which I guess is a pull, if I said that right. So, in one scenario, the first one, you're getting requests, and in the second one, you are actually initiating and making changes separately from a request. All right, so the requests that you can get, one is because the bank has changed, or maybe even the vendor's bank account number has changed along with the routing number. The vendor then is going to submit or should submit to you a change in banking information. And I do recommend that if the bank account has changed versus only the routing number, that you go through your normal process for vendor bank change requests. And so hopefully that has some authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices in that process so that you don't change uh, valid vendor banking into fraudulent vendor banking. And keep in mind, the fraudsters, they saw this too. So they may even initiate some fraudulent email requests to try to get in on might be the increased requests that you get, and so make sure that you have some your process in place to avoid fraud. Now, if you need that, please go to my training site. I have a great actually training session that I do called the Bank of AP, and I really talk about how to surround that confirmation call for bank changes with authentication techniques and internal controls. And so I'm going to leave a link to that in the show notes in case you need to put that into place if you don't already have it into place, to make sure you don't have fraud during this, what could be an increase in vendor requests to change banking, that whole process. All right, so you could receive an increase in the number of requests to change banking that's going to come from your vendors. That's one. And the other side is that if the vendors do not send you that request, either to change their routing number and or their bank account number, then at the time that you make your vendor's next payment, that information, the old banking details, is going to go off to the bank, and the bank is going to do either one of two things. They're either going to change that information to the new information, right? Maybe they only changed the routing number, so they're going to make that change internally so that the vendor's payment will post successfully. And when that happens, they are then going to send that information to your bank, and your bank is going to send you a notice of change, which really means that they are letting you know that the vendor's bank had to make a change in order to post that or make that ACH payment or wire payment successful. And that is your notification, right? That you need to go and update their vendor record. And so they can do that depending on the bank with both the routing number, and then they can also do it with a bank account number. But typically that is only when your vendor's bank or your vendor is banking with the same bank and they just change their account, their bank account number. So same routing number, same bank, they change their bank account number for whatever reason. If they don't tell you that and you send the old bank account over, then they may change that. But the point is that when you get that notice of change, or NOC, we used to call them knocks, but when you get those, then you have to initiate either sending a request to the vendor to change their banking if it includes the bank account number, or just updating the routing number if that was the only change. So you may get that NOC that will indicate that in this case, right, Silicon Valley's bank has changed their routing number to the National Bank of Santa Clara. But I have to tell you, I don't know if that will happen or not in this case because the bank failed. But just know that you may get increased NOCs. And when you do get those, you have to resolve those in a timely fashion, because if the banks are making the change in order for the payment to post successfully, they're not going to do that forever. And if you don't make that change, then your company could have a NACHA violation, which could mean some type of a fine or a penalty. So you can get those knocks back. You can also get, and I don't remember if they're on the same knock form or not, but if the information was not valid and the vendor's bank did not change it, then that ACH payment is not going to be successful. And that is going to trigger you then to go back to the vendor again and ask them to update, go through your process to update their banking. So those are really the two scenarios, maybe even three, where you're going to receive a request that's going to be the trigger for you to either update the file or go to update the vendor record, or go to the vendor to get them to submit whatever you require for an update. And just to summarize, those three are if the vendor reaches out and asks for a change in banking, if you receive a NOC from the bank that says that they had to make a change in order for the payment to be successful, and then three, if there was a payment failure, like the ACH was unsuccessful, you may get that back in a separate notification as well. All right, so now to talk about the second set, which is where the vendor team initiates changes. And this is actually something that I recommend as part of the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. It's one of the steps, and it is also something that I recommend that you do on a monthly basis. And if you can't do it monthly, you do it on a quarterly basis. If you can't do it quarterly, then you do it on a semi-annual basis. And then if you can't do it on a semi-annual basis, then you at least do it once a year. And that is, right, cleaning your vendor master file. And so of those 8 steps, validating the vendor bank account information is one of them. Now, there are 2 steps to validating the vendor bank account information. One is if you have the ability, have some type of subscription to early warning, or maybe the GAIAC platform or another platform that uses early warning as a reseller like GAIAC does, but it's in some of the vendor self-registration tools that are out there. If you have that, then you want to, when you clean your vendor master file, just recheck, right? Revalidate and make sure that that information is valid. Now, I get that if you have that, many people probably, or accounts payable teams, aren't looking to do that on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, because usually it costs. But I guess it depends on what plan you have. If it's not something that is going to increase your cost by checking it more than once per year, then I would say go ahead and do it. But I do recommend that you check it at least once per year. So that's one. You can check bank account ownership, and that means that you're checking to verify that the vendor's legal name equals the bank account holder's name, and maybe even the tax ID that was used to open up that account. Now, the other side, or the second step of this, is the bank branch details. So I always suggest, and again, this used to be based on the fact that vendor banks or banks merged and are acquired all the time, but now I'm going to add banks fail, are merged and acquired all the time. You need to make sure the routing numbers are still valid. And when I say routing numbers, I mean US and international. So it could be the ABA routing numbers from the Federal Reserve Board, where you can check those, or it could be routing numbers from Canada, and you can check on the Payments Canada site, or it could be a routing number from a non-US bank that does not have, or that country does not require an IBAN. So you have a BIC code. And so I do recommend that you validate the BIC code as well. And you can do that on the SWIFT network. And so all three of those should be checked based on your vendors. So that's something that I do recommend that you do. And if you need links to those, always in the show notes for these podcast episodes, I have a link to the vendor validation reference list. And that list has links to resources to validate information. And I've got a section for bank account information, and all three of them are there. So if you need to download that, please do that. Please click the link in the show notes. But when you check for the routing numbers, that's going to pull in all of the mergers, acquisitions, and failures, because the routing numbers are no longer going to be valid. Now, the bad news is that I don't know of a way other than actually, I don't know if that does it either. I don't know of a way to upload, like in bulk, all of the routing numbers. Let's take US for example. I don't know a way to upload all of the US routing numbers and validate that they are still good. When I check routing numbers, and I do have some clients where I do vendor master file cleanups, and so I will check the routing numbers to make sure they're still good, but I only know of a way to key it in, separately, that look up on a one-by-one basis. Again, either with the Federal Reserve Board, with Payments Canada, and with SWIFT. And even with Payments Canada, there's no keying in unless something has changed in the last month or so. You have to download PDFs and then check against that. So that's the way that I currently do it. There's, to my knowledge, no way to do a bulk upload, or so you don't have to do the one-by-one lookup. But what I do is I will just save it in an Excel spreadsheet, and then if things change, I can update that spreadsheet. But in any event, so I will do that on a one-by-one basis. And then for any vendor banks that have changed, the good news is that a lot of vendors share those same banks, right? And so you don't have to do a one-by-one of each vendor. You do a one-by-one lookup of each vendor bank, and then you take that vendor bank routing number and you update the remaining vendors. And this is one that I think is very key, because the vendors may not pay attention that they need to give you the information and tell you that their routing numbers have changed. They're notified, especially in mergers or acquisitions, and I'm sure especially in banks too, if the routing number is going to stay the same, but they are notified. Now, whether or not they think you need to know, that's a whole separate thing. But if only the routing number changes and their bank account number doesn't change, they don't often think that you need to have that information. And so it's really key to do this step when you clean your vendor master file. And again, I recommend you do it monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, and at the very least on an annual basis. So when you find these routing numbers that are no longer valid, you'll search for the correct bank name, the correct routing number, and then you can update your vendor's record, right? You do not have to have permission from the vendor to update their information, because if they haven't given you the change for a bank account, it is likely that only the routing number changed. Now, if for whatever reason the vendor's banking changed completely, maybe they went and changed to a different bank, then they should have let you know that anyway. You're still updating that bank's routing number, or whomever or whatever bank that bank became. And so if that changed, then your vendor should have let you know, because at that point the bank account number should have changed as well. All right, so that is the vendor team initiated request or initiated change for vendor banking that is normally found during the cleanup or vendor master file cleanup process. And just to answer that question very straightly here, that I know some people are still asking or listeners are still asking, is when my vendor's bank's routing number changes, do I need to reach out to the vendor or can I just make that change? And my recommendation is that if the routing number is the only thing that changed or only thing that you know that has changed, then you can make that change yourself. You do not have to reach out to the vendor. However, if the vendor's bank account number has changed, then you have to reach out to the vendor and you have to go through your process to update the vendor's banking. So I hope you enjoyed that replay. I do want to say that the Friday drop-in live sessions for 2 hours was discontinued. I found that more folks wanted immediate answers via email, or we just set up a member session if they are members of the Vendor Process Training Pass Center. And so make sure you check out that resource. I'll put a link to it in the description. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 287th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.